Section 17 of The Three Impostors by Arthur Machen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 2 of Novel of the White Powder. Dr. Haberden called a few days later. "I have no special news to give you," he said. "Chambers is out of town, so I know no more about that stuff than you do. But I should like to see Mr. Lester, if he is in." "He is in his room," I said. "I will tell him you are here." No, I will go up to him. We will have a little quiet talk together. I dare say that we have made a good deal of fuss about a very little, for after all, whatever the powder may be, it seems to have done him good." The doctor went upstairs, and standing in the hall I heard his knock, and the opening and shutting of the door, and then I waited in the silent house for an hour, and the stillness grew more and more intense as the hands of the clock crept round. Then there sounded from above the noise of a door shut sharply, and the doctor was coming down the stairs. His footsteps crossed the hall, and there was a pause at the door. I drew a long, sick breath with difficulty, and saw my face white in a little mirror, and he came in and stood at the door. There was an unutterable horror shining in his eyes. He steadied himself by holding the back of a chair with one hand, his lower lip trembled like a horse's, and he gulped and stammered unintelligible sounds before he spoke. "I have seen that man," he began in a dry whisper. "I have been sitting in his presence for the last hour. My God! And I am alive and in my senses. I, who have dealt with death all my life, and have dabbled with the melting ruins of the earthly tabernacle, but not this, oh, not this." And he covered his face with his hands as if to shut out the sight of something before him. "Do not send for me again, Miss Lester," he said with more composure. "I can do nothing in this house. Goodbye." As I watched him totter down the steps and along the pavement toward his house, it seemed to me that he had aged by 10 years since the morning. My brother remained in his room. He called out to me in a voice I hardly recognized that he was very busy, and would like his meals brought to his door, and left there. I gave the order to the servants. From that day it seemed as if the arbitrary conception we call time had been annihilated for me. I lived in an ever-present sense of horror, going through the routine of the house mechanically, and only speaking a few necessary words to the servants. Now and then I went out and paced the streets for an hour or two, and came home again, but whether I were without or within, my spirit delayed before the closed door of the upper room, and shuddering waited for it to open. I have said that I scarcely reckoned time, but I suppose it must have been a fortnight after Dr. Haberden's visit that I came home from my stroll, a little refreshed and lightened. The air was sweet and pleasant, and the hazy form of green leaves floating cloud-like in the square, and the smell of blossoms had charmed my senses, and I felt happier and walked more briskly. As I delayed a moment at the verge of the pavement, waiting for a van to pass by before crossing over to the house, I happened to look up at the windows, and instantly there was a rush and swirl of deep cold waters in my ears. My heart leapt up and fell down as into a deep hollow, and I was amazed with a dread and terror without form or shape. I stretched out a hand blindly through the folds of thick darkness from the black and shadowy valley, and held myself from falling, while the stones beneath my feet rocked and swayed and tilted, and the sense of solid things seemed to sink away from under me. I had glanced up at the window of my brother's study, and at that moment the blind was drawn aside, and something that had life stared out into the world. Nay, I cannot say I saw a face or any human likeness. A living thing, 2 eyes of burning flame glared at me, and they were in the midst of something as formless as my fear, the symbol and presence of all evil and all hideous corruption. I stood shuddering and quaking as with the grip of ague, sick with unspeakable agonies of fear and loathing, and for 5 minutes I could not summon force or motion to my limbs. When I was within the door, I ran up the stairs to my brother's room and knocked. "Francis, Francis," I cried, "for heaven's sake answer me! What is the horrible thing in your room? Cast it out, Francis, cast it from you." I heard a voice as of feet shuffling slowly and awkwardly, and a choking, gurgling sound as if someone was struggling to find utterance. And then the noise of a voice, broken and stifled, and words that I could scarcely understand. "There is nothing here," the voice said. "Pray do not disturb me. I am not very well today." I turned away, horrified and yet helpless. I could do nothing, and I wondered why Francis had lied to me, for I had seen the appearance beyond the glass too plainly to be deceived, though it was but the sight of a moment, and I sat still, conscious that there had been something else, something I had seen in the first flash of terror, before those burning eyes had looked at me. Suddenly I remembered, as I lifted my face, the blind was being drawn back, and I had had an instant's glance of the thing that was moving it, and in my recollection I knew that a hideous image was engraved forever on my brain. It was not a hand, there were no fingers that held the blind, but a black stump pushed it aside. The mouldering outline and the clumsy movement as of a beast's paw had glowed into my senses before the darkling waves of terror had overwhelmed me as I went down quick into the pit. My mind was aghast at the thought of this, and of the awful presence that dwelt with my brother in his room. I went to his door and cried to him again, but no answer came. That night one of the servants came up to me and told me in a whisper that for 3 days food had been regularly placed at the door and left untouched. The maid had knocked, but had received no answer. She had heard the noise of shuffling feet that I had noticed. Day after day went by, and still my brother's meals were brought to his door and left untouched. And though I knocked and called again and again, I could get no answer. The servants began to talk to me. It appeared they were as alarmed as I. The cook said that when my brother first shut himself up in his room, she used to hear him come out at night and go about the house, and once, she said, the hall door had opened and closed again, but for several nights she had heard no sound. The climax came at last. It was in the dusk of the evening, and I was sitting in the darkening, dreary room, when a terrible shriek jarred and rang harshly out of the silence, and I heard a frightened scurry of feet dashing down the stairs. I waited, and the servant maid staggered into the room and faced me, white and trembling. "Oh, Miss Helen," she whispered. "Oh, for the Lord's sake, Miss Helen, what has happened? Look at my hand, miss, look at that hand." I drew her to the window and saw that there was a black, wet stain upon her hand. "I do not understand you," I said. "Will you explain to me?" "I was going to your room just now," she began. "I was turning down the bedclothes, and all of a sudden there was something fell upon my hand, wet, and I looked up, and the ceiling was black and dripping on me." I looked hard at her and bit my lip. "Come with me," I said. "Bring your candle with you." The room I slept in was beneath my brother's, and as I went in I felt I was trembling. I looked up at the ceiling and saw a patch all black and wet, and a dew of black drops upon it, and a pool of horrible liquor soaking into the white bedclothes. I ran upstairs and knocked loudly. "Oh, Francis, Francis, my dear brother," I cried, "what has happened to you?" And I listened. There was a sound of choking, and a noise like water bubbling and regurgitating, but nothing else, and I called louder, but no answer came. In spite of what Dr Haberden had said, I went to him with tears streaming down my cheeks. I told him all that had happened, and he listened to me with a face set hard and grim. "For your father's sake," he said at last, "I will go with you, though I can do nothing." We went out together. The streets were dark and silent and heavy with heat and a drought of many weeks. I saw the doctor's face white under the gas lamps, and when we reached the house his hand was shaking. We did not hesitate. We went upstairs directly. I held the lamp, and he called out in a loud, determined voice, "Mr. Lester, do you hear me? I insist on seeing you. Answer me at once." There was no answer, but we both heard that choking noise I have mentioned. "Mr. Lester, I'm waiting for you. Open the door this instant, or I shall break it down." And he called a third time in a voice that rang and echoed from the walls, "Mr. Lester, for the last time I order you to open the door." "Ah," he said, after a pause of heavy silence, "we are wasting time here. Will you be so kind as to get me a poker or something of the kind?" I ran into a little room at the back, where odd articles were kept, and found a heavy adze-like tool that I thought might serve the doctor's purpose. "Very good," he said, "that will do, I dare say. I give you notice, Mr. Lester," he cried loudly at the keyhole, "that I am now about to break into your room." Then I heard the wrench of the adze, and the woodwork split and cracked under it. With a loud crash the door suddenly burst open, and for a moment we started back aghast at a fearful screaming cry, no human voice, but as the roar of a monster that burst forth inarticulate and struck at us out of the darkness. "Hold the lamp," said the doctor, and we went in and glanced quickly around the room. "There it is," said Dr. Haberden, drawing a quick breath. "Look in that corner." I looked, and a pang of horror seized my heart as with a white hot iron. There upon the floor was a dark and putrid mass, seething with corruption and hideous rottenness, neither liquid nor solid, but melting and changing before our eyes, and bubbling with unctuous oily bubbles like boiling pitch, and out of the midst of it shone two burning points like eyes, and I saw a writhing and stirring as of limbs, and something moved and lifted up what might have been an arm. The doctor took a step forward, raised the iron bar, and struck at the burning points. He drove in the weapon and struck again and again in the fury of loathing, and at last the thing was quiet. A week or two later, when I had to some extent recovered from the terrible shock, Dr. Haberden came to see me. "I have sold my practice," he began, "and tomorrow I am sailing on a long voyage. I do not know whether I shall ever return to England. In all probability I shall buy a little land in California and settle there for the remainder of my life. I have brought you this packet, which you may open and read when you feel able to do so. It contains the report of Dr. Chambers on what I submitted to him. Goodbye, Miss Lester, goodbye." When he was gone, I opened the envelope. I could not wait, and proceeded to read the papers within. Here is the manuscript, and if you will allow me, I will read you the astounding story it contains. "My dear Haberden," the letter began, "I have delayed inexcusably in answering your questions as to the white substance you sent me. To tell you the truth, I have hesitated for some time as to what course I should adopt, for there is a bigotry and orthodox standard in physical science as in theology, and I knew that if I told you the truth I should offend rooted prejudices which I once held dear myself. However, I have determined to be plain with you, and first I must enter into a short personal explanation. You have known me, Haberden, for many years as a scientific man. You and I have talked of our profession together, and discussed the hopeless gulf that opens before the feet of those who think to attain to truth by any means whatsoever except the beaten way of experiment and observation in the sphere of material things. I remember the scorn with which you have spoken to me of men of science who have dabbled a little in the unseen, and have timidly hinted that perhaps the senses are not, after all, the eternal, impenetrable bounds of all knowledge, the everlasting walls beyond which no human being has ever passed. We have laughed together heartily, and I think justly, at the occult follies of the day, disguised under various names, the mesmerisms, spiritualisms, materializations, theosophies, and all the rabble-rout of imposture, with their machinery of poor tricks and feeble conjuring, the true back parlour of shabby London streets. Yet, in spite of what I have said, I must confess to you that I am no materialist, taking the word, of course, in its usual significance. It is now many years since I have convinced myself, a skeptic, remember, that the old iron-bound theory is utterly and entirely false. Perhaps this confession will not wound you so sharply as it would have done 20 years ago, for I think you cannot have failed to notice that for some time hypotheses have been advanced by men of pure science which are nothing less than transcendental, and I suspect that most modern chemists and biologists of repute would not hesitate to subscribe the dictum of the old schoolman, omnia exeunt in mysterium, which means, I take it, that every branch of human knowledge, if traced up to its source and final principles, vanishes into mystery. I need not trouble you now with a detailed account of the painful steps which led me to my conclusions. A few simple experiments suggested a doubt as to my then standpoint, and a train of thought that rose from circumstances comparatively trifling brought me far. My old conception of the universe has been swept away, and I stand in a world that seems as strange and awful to me as the endless waves of the ocean seen for the first time shining from a peak in Darien. Now I know that the walls of sense that seemed so impenetrable, that seemed to loom up above the heavens, and to be found below the depths, and to shut us in for evermore, are no such everlasting impassable barriers as we fancied, but thinnest and most airy veils that melt away before the seeker and dissolve as the early mist of the morning about the brooks. I know that you never adopted the extreme materialistic position. You did not go about trying to prove a universal negative, for your logical sense withheld you from that crowning absurdity. But I am sure that you will find all that I am saying strange and repellent to your habits of thought. Yet, Haberden, what I tell you is the truth. Nay, to adopt our common language, the sole and scientific truth, verified by experience. And the universe is verily more splendid and more awful than we used to dream. The whole universe, my friend, is a tremendous sacrament, a mystic, ineffable force and energy, veiled by an outward form of matter. And man, and the sun, and the other stars, and the flower of the grass, and the crystal in the test tube, are each and every one as spiritual, as material, and subject to an inner working. You will perhaps wonder, Haberden, whence all this tends, but I think a little thought will make it clear. You will understand that from such a standpoint the whole view of things is changed, and what we thought incredible and absurd may be possible enough. In short, we must look at legend and belief with other eyes, and be prepared to accept tales that had become mere fables. Indeed, this is no such great demand. After all, modern science will concede as much in a hypocritical manner. You must not, it is true, believe in witchcraft, but you may credit hypnotism. Ghosts are out of date, but there is a good deal to be said for the theory of telepathy. Give superstition a Greek name and believe in it should almost be a proverb. So much for my personal explanation. You sent me, Haberden, a phial, stoppered and sealed, containing a small quantity of flaky white powder, obtained from a chemist who has been dispensing it to one of your patients. I am not surprised to hear that this power refused to yield any results to your analysis. It is a substance which was known to a few many hundred years ago, but which I never expected to have submitted to me from the shop of a modern apothecary. There seems no reason to doubt the truth of the man's tale. He no doubt got, as he says, the rather uncommon salt you prescribed from the wholesale chemist's, and it has probably remained on his shelf for 20 years, or perhaps longer. Here what we call chance and coincidence began to work. During all these years the salt in the bottle was exposed to certain recurring variations of temperature, variations probably ranging from 40 degrees to 80 degrees. And as it happens, such changes, recurring year after year at irregular intervals and with varying degrees of intensity and duration, have constituted a process, and a process so complicated and so delicate that I question whether modern scientific apparatus, directed with the utmost precision, could produce the same result. The white powder you sent me is something very different from the drug you prescribed. It is the powder from which the wine of the Sabbath, the vinum sabbati, was prepared. No doubt you have read of the witches' Sabbath, and have laughed at the tales which terrified our ancestors, the black cats and the broomsticks, and dooms pronounced against some old woman's cow. Since I have known the truth, I have often reflected that it is on the whole a happy thing that such burlesque as this is believed, for it serves to conceal much that is better should not be known generally. However, if you care to read the appendix to Payne Knight's monograph, you will find that the true Sabbath was something very different, though the writer has very nicely refrained from printing all he knew. The secrets of the true Sabbath were the secrets of remote times surviving into the Middle Ages, secrets of an evil science which existed long before Aryan man entered Europe. Men and women, seduced from their homes on specious pretenses, were met by beings well qualified to assume, as they did assume, the part of devils, and taken by their guides to some desolate and lonely place, known to the initiate by long tradition, and unknown to all else. Perhaps it was a cave in some bare and wind-swept hill, perhaps some inmost recess of a great forest. And there the Sabbath was held. There, in the blackest hour of night, the vinum sabbati was prepared, and this evil gruel was poured forth and offered to the neophytes, and they partook of an infernal sacrament, sumentes calicem principis inferorum, as the old author well expresses it. And suddenly each one that had drunk found himself attended by a companion, a share of glamour and unearthly allurement beckoning him apart, to share in joys more exquisite, more piercing than the thrill of any dream, to the consummation of the marriage of the Sabbath. It is hard to write of such things as these, and chiefly because that shape that allured with loveliness was no hallucination, but awful as it is to express the man himself. By the power of that Sabbath wine, a few grains of white powder thrown into a glass of water, the house of life was riven asunder, and the human trinity dissolved, and the worm which never dies, that which lies sleeping within us all, was made tangible and an external thing, and clothed with a garment of flesh. And then, in the hour of midnight, the primal fall was repeated and represented, and the awful thing veiled in the mythos of the tree in the garden was done anew. Such was the nuptiae sabbati. I prefer to say no more. You, Haberden, know as well as I do that the most trivial laws of life are not to be broken with impunity. And for so terrible an act as this, in which the very inmost place of the temple was broken open and defiled, a terrible vengeance followed. What began with corruption ended also with corruption. Underneath is the following in Dr. Haberden's writing. The whole of the above is unfortunately, strictly and entirely true. Your brother confessed all to me on that morning when I saw him in his room. My attention was first attracted to the bandaged hand, and I forced him to show it to me. What I saw made me, a medical man of many years' standing, grow sick with loathing, and the story I was forced to listen to was infinitely more frightful than I could have believed possible. It has tempted me to doubt the eternal goodness which can permit nature to offer such hideous possibilities. And if you had not with your own eyes seen the end, I should have said to you, disbelieve it all. I have not, I think, many more weeks to live, but you are young and may forget all this. Joseph Haberden, M.D. In the course of 2 or 3 months, I heard that Dr. Haberden had died at sea shortly after the ship left England. Miss Leicester ceased speaking and looked pathetically at Dyson, who could not refrain from exhibiting some symptoms of uneasiness. He stuttered out some broken phrases expressive of his deep interest in her extraordinary history, and then said with a better grace, "But pardon me, Miss Leicester, I understood you were in some difficulty. You were kind enough to ask me to assist you in some way." "Ah," she said, "I had forgotten that. My own present trouble seems of such little consequence in comparison with what I have told you. But as you are so good to me, I will go on. You will scarcely believe it, but I found that certain persons suspected, or rather pretended to suspect, that I had murdered my brother. These persons were relatives of mine, and their motives were extremely sordid ones. But I actually found myself subject to the shameful indignity of being watched. Yes, sir, my steps were dogged when I went abroad, and at home I found myself exposed to constant if artful observation. With my high spirit this was more than I could brook, and I resolved to set my wits to work and delude the persons who were shadowing me. I was so fortunate as to succeed. I assumed this disguise, and for some time have lain snug and unsuspected. But of late I have reason to believe that the pursuer is on my track, unless I am greatly deceived. I saw yesterday the detective who is charged with the odious duty of observing my movements. You, sir, are watchful and keen-sighted. Tell me, did you see anyone lurking about this evening?" "I hardly think so," said Dyson, "but perhaps you would give me some description of the detective in question." "Certainly. He is a youngish man, dark, with dark whiskers. He has adopted spectacles of large size in the hope of disguising himself effectually, but he cannot disguise his uneasy manner and the quick, nervous glances he casts to right and left." This piece of description was the last straw for the unhappy Dyson, who was foaming with impatience to get out of the house, and would gladly have sworn 18th century oaths if propriety had not frowned on such a course. "Excuse me, Miss Leicester," he said with cool politeness, "I cannot assist you." "Ah," she said sadly, "I have offended you in some way. Tell me what I have done, and I will ask you to forgive me." "You are mistaken," said Dyson, grabbing his hat, but speaking with some difficulty. "You have done nothing. But as I say, I cannot help you. Perhaps," he added with some tinge of sarcasm, "my friend Russell might be of service." "Thank you," she replied. "I will try him." And the lady went off into a shriek of laughter, which filled up Mr Dyson's cup of scandal and confusion. He left the house shortly afterwards, and had the peculiar delight of a 5-mile walk through streets which slowly changed from black to grey, and from grey to shining passages of glory for the sun to brighten. Here and there he met or overtook strayed revellers, but he reflected that no one could have spent the night in a more futile fashion than himself, and when he reached his home he had made resolves for reformation. He decided that he would abjure all Milesian and Arabian methods of entertainment, and subscribe to Mudie's for a regular supply of mild and innocuous romance. End of Novel of the White Powder.